Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Dr. Paul Foxman. Dr. Foxman is a psychologist and founder and director of the Vermont Center for Anxiety Care. He is also the author of Dancing with Fear, Controlling Stress and Creating a Life Beyond Panic and Anxiety, as well as The Worried Child, Recognizing Anxiety in Children and Helping Them Heal. Welcome.
Thank you, Natasha. Thanks for having me.
There's so much that we could talk about. I mean, you have these two very dense, rich books with information. And I think probably today it would be good to focus on The Worried Child. So you talk about today's children being the shell-shocked generation. The increasing rate of traumas to children such as divorce and family breakdown, crime and violence, drug abuse, a failing school system, and recent terrorism is affecting our children and producing anxiety in many cases. This shocked me. The number of adolescent suicides has doubled since the 1970s, and whereas previously there were no known suicides under the age of 14, today there are cases as young as 5 years of age. And last but not least, it is estimated that up to 19% of children carry weapons to school. And each week, one student is killed by a firearm. No wonder they are a shell-shocked generation.
And they know what's going on through social media. They're very tuned into the culture and the world.
Yes. And social media, yes. It's like we can kind of wave a wand and touch 6 or 7 areas, but social media is kind of the common thread. And you and I are not going to solve those problems. Social media is not going anywhere. So let's talk about what we can do. What are the steps that individuals can take, individual parents, school teachers, children themselves?
Well, I think first it would help to understand anxiety and where it's coming from. That can inform us as to what we can do to be helpful. So if it would make sense, I'll just share a framework for understanding anxiety that explains who gets it, when it happens, how it happens, and then again, what we can do to be helpful. So I say there are 3 ingredients in the development of anxiety, and it does begin in childhood. And the first ingredient is the genetic ingredient, which I've been calling biological sensitivity. Turns out that about 20% of infants are born more sensitive to external stimuli, lights and sounds and temperature, and also we know they're more sensitive to internal sensations like fluctuations in blood sugar level, fatigue, tension, and that is could be thought of as a temperament, sensitive temperament, 20%. That in itself doesn't really lead to anxiety, but then there are some personality traits that are common in children and the adults they become who are anxious. They're often perfectionistic, they have high standards, they have difficulty relaxing, they like to please, they don't like conflict, so they're conflict avoidant, and they prefer structure and predictability. So those are what I call the anxiety personality profile. So now we have the genetic ingredient, and we have what I call the learned ingredient. In psychology, we think that personality forms as a result of the interaction between temperament and early life experiences, typically within the family. So
I'm going to interrupt you here for 1 second. So I interrupted you because you're talking about the components of anxiety. And not only are you a psychologist and well-trained in this, but I think it's important to state in your book, you write that you yourself developed several anxiety conditions early in life, including post-traumatic stress and generalized anxiety. And as an adult, you experienced panic anxiety with agoraphobia. So you write, a number of childhood experiences set the stage for these anxiety reactions. My parents' divorce, sexual abuse, a near death, resulting in a tracheotomy, and growing up in a violent and racially tense community in New York City, known at the time as Hell's Kitchen. So you speak from experience. And I think, again, right now, times seem much more compelling in terms of anxiety. But even decades ago, what you're talking about is, so your personality being not your personality, but being born with certain sensitivities, and then the external world. So let's talk a little bit about, well, how do we deal with that? So here we are. I'm born with certain sensitivities, and then all these things happen. Then what?
Well, you've just put your finger on the third ingredient, which is stress. All of those adverse childhood experiences that I had that you just mentioned were the stressors that activated the anxiety in someone like myself who was predisposed by virtue of that sensitive temperament and those personality traits. So that tells us that one of the things we can do is we could control anxiety by managing stress. So if the question that you asked earlier was what can we do to be helpful, there are a few things we can do. One of them is teach people how to manage stress, because stress is inherent in life, but we can counteract the effects of it through things like getting enough sleep, diet, nutrition, exercise, what I call behavioral health. And that also addresses some of those sensitivities too, because people who are anxious do better when they get enough sleep and when they eat well and they exercise and reduce tension. And so that's the first thing we can do, teach stress management skills. We also can talk about what we can do to some of those personality traits, teach people how to change the way they're thinking so they're not activating themselves, not scaring themselves. If you want, we can talk about that. But basically, the external world is the set of stressors that activates anxiety in people who are predisposed. I like to say that those first two ingredients means that you're an anxiety disorder waiting to happen.
Right.
And it'll happen in response to stress. In virtually every case I've ever worked with, there was a period of high stress before the anxiety symptoms showed up.
I want to interject something here because, you talk about getting enough sleep and diet and everything else. And I think people have heard that so often that they go, oh, yeah, right, one of these days I'll do that. But I think, as you're describing it, it is hugely significant, because if you don't have all those resources to call on, just physical resources, then everything else gets exacerbated. So I think it's very significant.
I'll give you an example. A recent survey of high school students found that 90% of them said that they rarely get more than 6 hours of sleep on school nights. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics says that teens should get 9 to 10. So if there are 5 school nights a week, you've got a 15-hour sleep deficit. And that's just the beginning. Then the next question was, well, what are you doing in the hour before you go to sleep? And virtually all of them were exposed to an electronic screen, either doing their homework on their computers or texting their friends. So there's another recommendation that goes back to the media, which is to manage children and adults' exposure to electronic screens, because we now know that the light emitted by electronic screens is stimulating to the human brain, which means that if we're trying to go to sleep at night, we should probably turn them off. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, with respect to children, 1 hour before bedtime. And then the question always is, well, what are you going to do instead? And that's where some of these stress management techniques, relaxation techniques come into play. How do we wind down and prepare ourselves for sleep? The brain produces hormones like melatonin, for example, that induces drowsiness, but that's light regulated. And so if you're looking at an electronic screen after the sun goes down, your brain doesn't know what time it is. And it won't produce that hormone that will induce drowsiness, which is why I once read that Starbucks is opening one new coffee shop every single day somewhere in the world, because we really are sleep-deprived culture, if not globally.
Wow. And it's interesting that you say that, because I was having issues with insomnia, and just through the research I did and whatever, I decided that one of the issues was, since I work for myself, being at my computer, it's I can do it whenever I want. And I stepped away. I've started the practice of stepping away from the computer between 7:30 and 8 at night. And it makes a huge difference, interestingly enough.
So you have experience that verifies that recommendation.
Yes. So, part of the issue also is, I think, for parents to educate themselves. Again, we all have that complaint. We are sitting in a restaurant, we see the family, and everybody's looking at a screen, and we go, oh my God, oh my God. But it's not, and then we, turn it off because it's just the way things are. I don't think people get quite how significant that is and what it's costing us. Because in order to produce an atmosphere that is less anxiety producing, we have to be actively involved in that. We have to be exploring what's going on. How are we living our life? How are we contributing? What can we do differently? Because I think parents want to do right by their children, but we've been seduced by the general way things are.
I recently read a book called Irresistible, and I believe the subtitle was The Addictive Nature of Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked. So there's brain stimulation involved in social media and clicking and online shopping and texting, and so the culture is sort of designed to keep us hooked.
Yes.
And what you just said is we have to be more proactive in setting limits. For example, in my book, I have a section on managing children's media exposure, which I written really for parents to help them know what to do to manage it. Because a lot of times in families, there's conflict between parents and children on media use.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Parents need to understand what you just said was the impact of it, so they have a reason to set those limits.
Yes. And, there's this book, I haven't read all of it, but it's about technology and kind of taking a future look at the impact, but it's called Alone Together. And that says it all.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So again, it's really, everybody laments how the family is going down the tubes and how the children are disconnected but society is a reflection of our individual choices. So, as a psychologist, how do you guide parents and children? What changes do you coach them to make in their lives?
Well, as I said a few moments ago, recognizing the role of stress and anxiety means that we have to teach stress management skills, and that there's a whole range of things. We have to learn how to manage time. Time management is an important skill. I was refer to the Stephen Covey approach to time management, and I teach that. So that's one of the ways I talk to parents and children about managing time.
And what a useful skill to teach children.
Because we're all overloaded, and
yes.
One reason because we're trying to do too much. In the Dancing with Fear book, I have a chapter on, I think it's called Sitting Still, and I said that the promise of technology was that we would have more time, because we'd have devices that would do things for us, like automatic thermostats and garage door openers and so on. And guess what? Nobody feels like they have more time, because we keep filling it. And so there is one area where we can guide people in learning how to manage time and create time, or at least earmark time with no agenda. And I noticed that you wanted to do a little sitting meditation before we started our conversation. So apparently you've learned the value of taking a little time to reset. It helps with focus. Ultimately, we'll be more productive if we take time out to just clear our minds and be able to focus. And meditation would be another skill I would teach. You can teach preschoolers to meditate.
And they love it.
And how to be in control of your body. So there could be yoga, you could teach martial arts. I mean, these are the skills really about self-control or self-regulation to, again, manage the effect of the external stresses.
And children aren't, especially the younger children, they just want to do what the adults are doing. They're willing to explore anything, So if you say meditation, oh, okay, they don't have any preconceived idea of that's going to be boring or whatever. And but again, it's up to the parents. It's the parents' job to introduce it. And if they're not taking care of themselves, the children can't be expected to do it.
Bingo. Children learn primarily by imitation.
Yes.
Virtually everything we've learned to do, we've learned by imitation, especially in childhood. So the parents become the role models.
Yes.
There's sort of an inside joke in child therapy, which is that often it's the parents who have the problem and not the child. And so what we do is we involve the parents in our counseling with children. We may start with their definition of the problem.
Right.
We almost invariably involve them in one form or another. We have parent conferences, just like schools do. We want the parents to be good role models for stress management, for example.
And I think they want to be, but they've just been sucked into the vortex as well. So it kind of takes somebody saying, stop, cease and desist,
There's an approach in therapy called family systems therapy, in which the idea is that if a parent brings a child in for counseling, the child is in effect a symptom of the family.
Yes.
That the family needs some support and help in readjusting and changing some of their patterns, so that it's like the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
The sacrificial lamb, if you will.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at the bigger picture, the environment of a child, in order to be helpful.
Yeah, because they're not growing up in a vacuum. It's funny. I had a coaching client, and he, we were talking about, kind of time management and balance in life. And he had kids who were maybe 6 or 7, and they loved their games and technology. And they were twins, as I remember it. And so I said to him, what happens at the dinner table? And he said, oh, they've got it there, And I said, well, I would coach you to stop that. New rule. He said, oh, they're going to hate that. I said, yeah, they will, but they'll get used to it. Have a conversation, even if you're arguing. You're still interacting. It's better than, And a couple of months later, he said, oh, yeah, no problem. No technology at the table. They just got used to it.
That's a perfect example of setting a reasonable limit on media use.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just, and also, by the way, family dinners have been, research has found that the one thing that a family can do that would reduce anxiety, would also improve bonding to the family, and also reduce susceptibility to negative peer influence, would be family dinners. But it turns out that only 40% of American families have dinner together 3 times a week or more. Less than half. So turn off the TV, you're sitting together, turn off the technology, and communicate.
Yeah.
Review and plan and connect.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect opportunity.
And again, we're not telling people to change their lifestyle, to change their lives. We're just asking them to bring in something else that will contribute to the well-being of the family and the future adults.
We're raising the next generation.
Yes. And they did testing where they showed that kids who are entering college now have a huge drop, I forget what the percentage is, in empathy. Now, why is that? Well, because it's hard to have empathy for a screen. Life looks like a movie. So you might have some feelings about it, but you're not interacting at the level where you're expected to respond and interact and get connected. So we've disconnected ourselves in our search for connection.
Some years ago, the American Psychological Association did an analysis of hundreds of studies on television viewing, which I think applies now to more current technology. They found that children who watch 2 or more hours of television per day, and it doesn't matter what they watch, are likely to experience 3 effects. More anxiety, that is more fear of the world around them, less sensitivity to the feelings of other people, which is what you just talked about, lower empathy, and more aggressive behavior, because there's a tremendous amount of violence in the media, and all media, video games, television, and so on. So one of them was lower empathy, and it doesn't matter what you watch.
Yeah.
because
Wow.
you're desensitizing to feeling.
And I think one of the reasons I also want to talk about this is we become unaware of what it costs us and what it costs our children, because it's kind of the default position. This is the way life is. Everybody's stressed. Everybody seems to be operating the same way. It costs you the juice in life. It costs you your family. It costs you connection. And I think that's one of the most significant things we need to address. And again, you don't have to, move into the wilderness and, live on a farm. You can do it in your everyday life. Simple, skillful tools.
I learned how to meditate in Los Angeles.
There you go.
Just underneath the Santa Monica Airport flight pattern. But I was going to say something. It just slipped my mind, but it'll come back. I forget what it was, but yes, we can teach our children how to manage stress in that way.
I'm going to ask you two things that I took out of the book, and then if your thought comes back, feel free. So one of them is you say how to stop unwanted thoughts or behavior. And the reality is our thoughts create the world we live in, what we believe, what we attach to, and some of our thoughts will mug us if we let them. So you talk about relabel, refocus, relax. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, a lot of our thought patterns are habits that we engage in. They're automatic. So another way to ask the question is, how do we change our thought patterns? And my answer would be, in order to change a habit, we have to practice an alternative. We have to develop a new habit that counteracts it. And a new habit takes time to develop. For example, with worry, a lot of times worry is a habit. I mean, there are people who will actually say, I'm a worrier, meaning that's my habitual way of thinking. That's a problem in itself because they've identified themselves as a worrier, so as though it's their identity. But what's the opposite of worry? Well, it's optimism. It's believing things will work out, or trusting that you'll be able to figure out what to do if and when there's a problem. So I like to teach people through affirmations, positive thinking. And I say every time you have a negative thought or a worry thought, this is what you'll say to yourself several times instead. It's like creating new neural pathways in the brain.
So what might that sound like?
Well, if you give me an example, or I can give an example of a worry thought, I'll actually do a demonstration of how to create the antidote, the opposite, the positive affirmation.
So when I was a young mother, the first thought that came with my first child immediately was, oh my God, now I'm vulnerable. Anything can happen, and that, to my child, and something bad is likely to happen. Now, I learned how not to do that, but that was the thought. God, I have to be vigilant. I have to be protective. I have to be observant. Terrible things can happen. So what would you have done with that?
And that's very common, by the way, for new parents. There's two variations of it. One is something bad will happen to my child, and the other is something bad will happen to me, leaving my child bereft.
I had both of those.
And so a worry really is a story about the future, but it's a negative story. And so I say, well, first of all, we don't really know what's going to happen, so let's assume that things will work out, and let's take the essence of that worry, which is something bad will happen, and I will lose my child, or my child will lose me. And the opposite of loss is what? Gratitude for what you have in the moment. I have a beautiful child. I'm going to assume that this will be a gift mutually, and life will be good. And so when you have that worry, you say, it's not happening now. Things are likely to work out. Time will tell. But in the moment, in the meantime, I'm going to act as though the present will continue. The future really is a continuation, right, of the present.
Yes, yes.
That's how I stopped worrying, by the way. I was a worrier, but I had an experience about midlife, just around late 30s, 40 years of age. I realized that my worry about the future, which was something bad was going to happen, I'd be back on the street in Hell's Kitchen. I said, why wouldn't the future be a continuation of my life story, which is that things have tended to work out? So I'm just going to change the story, assume that things will work out, and then see what happens. And it really changed my life. And so maybe if you check in with me in a year or 10, something bad will have happened, but in the meantime, I wasn't worrying about it. It really was remarkable. Just changing the
story. And it's really, and it is a story. It's a future that hasn't happened, and we create it in our minds, create stressors, and then make choices out of that worry. And so I think it's quite brilliant. It's just, first of all, it's recognizing the worry in the moment when it's happening, the impact, and kind of, oh, this is a story, let me make up a different story and go with that. And it's not like airy-fairy. The fact is, as you say, life is a continuum. Why would my future not be a continuum of, the way it is now, where I'm doing well, I'm doing fine?
I got this far.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I think that's a powerful, powerful tool.
Another approach which is what I call the Buddhist approach to worry, which is a technique I call witnessing. And that is simple. It's a very simple technique, and it's the idea of labeling your worry as a thought habit. When you catch yourself doing it, you say what I call witnessing self-statements like, oh, that's my worry habit. I know you. A thought is not a fact. It's not happening now. And then my all-time favorite is, don't believe everything you think.
Yes, absolutely.
Just think it doesn't make it real.
Yes.
And it might not even be terribly unique, that it just may be a worry thought that's floating in the universe and you're hosting it.
Yes.
And you don't have to. You could let it go.
I think that's awesome. Again, simple, skillful tools. So we have like 2 minutes left. Is there any message you want to relay in that 2 minutes?
Well, I certainly want people to know that it's possible to get in control of anxiety. I've seen it so many times in my professional work. I've been a psychologist for 47 years. Of course, my interns, when I say I was licensed in 1973, before they were even born, they can't believe it. But I personally and professionally, I just want it to be known that you can get in control. You're not a victim of anxiety. It's largely a habit that can be changed. So that would be one message. Simple
but profound. And I really invite people to check out your books, because they're a kind of, there's information there, there's explanation, there's the psychology, and then there are things to do and suggestions. So absolutely, I invite people to check them out. So we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for being my guest, and I want to thank you for writing your books. And I'm hoping that maybe we can do this again sometime.
I'm available. Call anytime.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.